So just a little about my background. I actually restructured my whole presentation last night after yesterday's discussion because I was originally invited to come speak as a student researcher. I have been working on my PhD with the University of Prince Edward Island, but then when Heather called me just recently, I had to say I'm not a student anymore. I've taken a leave from that position, and I'm in a reevaluation of my own goals and research objectives. So this is perfect opportunity to receive your feedback on what I've been doing to date. But it's really about the journey, and my journey began here. So as a master's student, most of you are working on thesis projects don't often think that that thesis is going to influence where you go. Mine did significantly. I was looking for a reason to move back home to do my research, and so I picked coastal landscapes as a master's project, and at that time engaged in climate change discussions. It was right around the time of Katrina had happened maybe 2 years before. An Inconvenient Truth had just come out. Climate change was a buzzword, but it really wasn't an integrated topic into planning and design processes. So it was still fairly new, I think, in the landscape architecture realm. I moved back home to PEI and began working for the city of Charlottetown. So I'm just going to kind of jump into some of the work that I did early on. As a city of Charlottetown planner, I started working as a development officer for them right away in a school, and actually I think before I graduated, I was invited to participate in the Sea Change project. And that enabled me to take that climate change research I had just been doing and immediately apply it to the work that I was doing with the city of Charlottetown. It also gave me an opportunity to meet some incredible people across the country. Don Forbes, to name one, he's now retired, but he worked in the Geological Survey of Canada for many years and really did groundbreaking work on sea level rise projections and mapping in Atlantic Canada and in the north. So I had access to his data and to him personally to have conversations about the work and where we should be going in terms of adaptation. I also met Colleen Mercer-Clark through that process. And she's a past president of CSLA. Some of you may know her as a landscape architect practitioner, but she also has a PhD in coastal management from Dalhousie and was a coastal ecologist in her former life. So I've been working with Colleen ever since on climate change issues and landscape architects. As through this project, which actually spanned 5 years, we were the landscape architects on the team, and so we've just hit it off from that. So the whole project really was just about community partnerships between the Caribbean and Canada and collaborations. So there was no product of the project from my perspective as a City of Charlottetown perspective until we had an opportunity. And so a couple of years into the project, the City of Charlottetown was having a whole lot of development pressure on the waterfront, and so we were undertaking a master plan as planners. And the public was really engaged in public space debate, heights of building debate, but no one really cared about the coastal issues of climate change except that Hurricane Sandy hit right in the middle of that project. And we conveniently had our public meeting scheduled in advance for 2 weeks after that storm hit. So when we brought everybody in to debate waterfront land use, all everybody wanted to talk about was sea level rise. Conveniently, I had just come from a meeting with the Sea Change group, and I had all of that data to just spill out to the public, and we started a dialogue that really hadn't happened within the city up until that point, and everybody was on board. So we adopted regulations immediately later that fall on land uses within flood risk zones, minimum floor elevations for new building structures, and on renovations, additions, and different policies on how we'll deal with new buildings being built in the waterfront. And then also policies on the city's ability to buy out properties that are at risk, that aren't worth protecting, for example, but also as a public realm benefit to the city. So protection of properties isn't just about private properties. We can use those protections and the connectivity of the coastline as a public benefit as well. So all of that came really fast because I had access to the data, and I was engaged in that Sea Change project as kind of an off the side of my desk project at the time, but it actually showed me that applied research can happen and make a big difference in the city, and so we've had those regulations in place for about 6 years now. Oh, and I should mention, Acoustics Planning and Design was the landscape architecture and planning firm that did the waterfront plan, so I was the city staff working with their team. Soon after that project, I left the city of Charlottetown to explore climate change projects at a different scale. And so I started working with the province on a variety of projects. But this one, I was brought in late on the project. It was led by researchers at St. FX University out of the economics department. So at the time I was like, oh, yeah, sure, I can help out. What do they need? And I just needed, my role was data collection. I was going to be the PEI case study coordinator on data collection for them. But as I engaged with the group of economics specialists that were working on this project, we realized that we were missing a lot of the pieces to the puzzle. So we were analyzing 6 different case study sites across the Atlantic provinces and doing a cost-benefit analysis on what it meant to adapt these properties. And they were looking at it entirely financially. So the land has a value, a market value, and what does the assets, the infrastructure value. And when I came into the project from PEI's perspective, campground and provincial park was our site. They were kind of focused on this highway over here, but I was able to recognize that there's a value here that can't be measured in dollars, because this is a local provincial park. It's going to attract tourists. It attracts the local area. It's the summer spot where everyone hangs out in this end of the island and this beach. And so we started a dialogue on the value of the natural resources in the area, or the ecological value, and what does it mean to value our beaches as public spaces, as natural landscapes, and what they are. And so I really recognized in that project, and particularly with this site, that I brought something to the discussion that was missing as a landscape architect, right? So at this point I could be proud to say that, well, that's why I have this other background. I'm not just a planner, I'm not just a data collector. And so I went from being the PEI case study coordinator to being the Newfoundland coordinator as well. So they wanted me to come in and analyze these sites from a different perspective. I had stakeholder meetings with the fishermen involved with the harbor sites, and really got discussions going. With the Tracadie Harbor site in particular, we were talking about flood risks and the lifespan of a wharf, and whether or not we could just raise the elevation of the structures over time based on the maintenance schedule, and therefore save money, of course. And the fishermen were looking at me like, well, by that time we're not going to be fishing here anymore. The temperatures of the water are rising. And so it opened up a whole different discussion that wasn't part of that initial economic assessment. And eventually I became the lead author on the whole NRCan project, because to collaborate between the 4 provinces, we needed someone to oversee the whole thing. The results of this study, from an economic perspective, I honestly don't even remember. Those are in some economic peer-reviewed journals. But from a climate change research perspective, were pretty huge, because it really exposed the need for these social issues to be discussed and to be measured, and that it wasn't just a science or a dollar signs issue that we were dealing with. And so I've been really engaged with the provinces, across Atlantic provinces, ever since this one. But on a completely different scale, working with the province and with the city, I'm recognizing that individual properties are being developed, not designed on PEI. We are a very small province. If you're not familiar with us, it's, what are we, 250 kilometers wide and about 1,000 kilometers of coastline, and 145,000 people. We're developed from tip to tip. We don't have a vast rural landscape. We are an agricultural fishing province, and our coastline is almost entirely residential. So where there's not a small craft harbor, there are cottages or homes. And nobody's hiring landscape architects. I'm the only one there. So I am not doing design work for individual properties. So it really became an issue of regulation for development rather than what I could do as a designer on these properties. So with the province, we coordinated the coastal property guide, and again, brought together information from lots of different departments, from the Environment Department, Planning Department, municipalities, all the different issues. What does it mean to put a septic tank next to the coastline where it's eroding? And what can property owners do to address those concerns of risk at the coast? So this document is something that the province uses on a regular basis within their planning department, but it covers a lot of different areas of jurisdiction because environment and planning are seen as two separate things. What was special about it, or what was unique, was that it was written in plain language and that it combined all of those different sources into one, rather than just going to the regulations or the acts of the different departments. It was all in one place, and that it was end user focused. So we knew what the developers or the property owners were asking, like what can I do with my lot? How close to the cliff can I build? And we wanted to answer those specific questions with this document. One of the things that came up from this one project was the realization that most of what we were telling them were recommendations and not regulations or requirements, and specifically in regard to erosion control measures. So that's when I kind of broached the subject of we really need to deal with what we're doing on the coastline. And so for about a year I was working with the province on how do we rework the regulations around seawalls and armoring the coastline. Erosion is actually a more immediate threat than sea level rise, even though sea level rise is a major issue on our coast. But erosion is happening very rapidly in some of the areas, and it's sporadic. It's storm driven rather than a gradual linear process. And I wasn't really able to progress anywhere from a legislation perspective, and so that's where the PhD came into the project. Because we didn't have any background research on why we should legislate and why we should restrict what people are doing to protect their properties. So I started the PhD at the University of Prince Edward Island, the Climate Research Lab in their Environmental Science Department. They do a lot of work on data collection. It's led by a climatologist, Adam Fennick. He's quite well known for the work that he does in terms of risk and vulnerability assessments. And so I was quite happy to be in that environment and working with those people on the initial stages of this project, which was to look at what the shoreline structures were doing to the coast. So my research question is, do the benefits of shoreline structures as an adaptation strategy to address coastal risks of climate change justify the potential long-term environmental and socio-cultural impacts of the coastline of Prince Edward Island? Sounds very PhD-ish. What we needed to do was first find out where the structures were. We had you require a permit to put a structure in, but there's actually no record then of anything other than the administration process of approving the permit. So we created an inventory and then to be able to assess the impacts. So step one of my methodology was the inventory, and so I've been spending the last 2 years studying the coast PEI in great detail. The first images of my photos, so all the photos that I've taken are geo-referenced, and we flew a small plane, 4-seater, with 2 photographers and a pilot. We had 6 flights, about 2 to 3 hours each. We were able to cover the whole coastline, and we documented the whole coast at a high resolution like the top image there. So we have the entire coastline documented in imagery. From that imagery, I created an inventory of what is where in terms of structures, and then this past summer I've been on foot with survey equipment actually measuring that and determining what the material is and what the condition is of those structures. From an impacts analysis stage, this is where I'm at in the research project and now on leave, so it's going to sit here for a little while, but the impacts are regional from the littoral cell stage. So a littoral cell is sort of like a watershed, but from the water's perspective, it's where the sediment transport processes are all contained within. And then also from a cumulative perspective, because it's not just properties impact, it's when properties continually are armored that they create a cumulative impact there. So some of the impacts that we're seeing, they're obvious. I don't have to continue my research to find these. I can see them right out of the photos. Is the end effects on adjacent unarmored properties, the loss of a sandy beach on the seaward side of an armored. So this area here is a popular public beach, but it was armored by the developer that put this house in, and within a year or two, the sandy beach connection from the south to the north was lost. So at high tide, people can't walk the length of the coastline here anymore. That's not a very good image, but that's habitat loss. We have endangered species within the coastal zone, and then we have public safety and marine hazards due to debris, because structures eventually fail if they're not maintained. And this brings back to the question raised in the previous one about the jurisdictions, because who is responsible for cleaning up the concrete and debris once it's in the waterway? It's no longer on the private property that it was built to protect. And sometimes properties change hands, and then the new owner doesn't want to take responsibility for it, and they're saying, someone come clean up the beach. This is public realm. Anything under high tide is the public. And there's that cumulative impacts image again. So the boundary of blurred authorities, it would be the third step of my research if I was to continue on the current path that I'm on. And that's because we have municipal and provincial and federal jurisdictions all combined as previously discussed. Talking to this room, I think you all probably are recognizing the piece that's missing and why I'm leaving the program at this stage in the research, and that's where are the people and where are the stories. I walk the beach all summer, 20,000 steps a day. I was very proud of myself. But the most interesting days were the ones that the property owners were there or the tourists were there, and they wanted to know what I was doing with this equipment and the stories that I collected. And then coming back to my lab and them saying, you can't use that. You didn't get ethics approval to talk to those people. And I was like, but that's where the story is, and that's where the story of what we're valuing here and why are we armoring these properties is. And so that's the direction I'd like to take the research in terms of what is the cost-benefit analysis. If you're only looking at the economics of it, it's not very interesting to me. So the research itself on hard structures is not new. It's been done quite a bit in the States, but it is new in Canada. I think BC's quite a bit ahead of the Atlantic coast, but I like to say we're the first to do it province-wide. We have the benefit of being much smaller than BC, but I think we do need to look elsewhere and beyond Canada because the regulations are in many different countries around the world that just not allowing people to alter that coastal landscape anymore for their own private benefit of protecting a private house. So do I have 2 more minutes? How am I doing? Okay. In addition to that work that I've been doing as practice and as research, I'm very actively engaged in the associations. Heather mentioned I was president of APALA. That happened within about 6 months of me actually becoming a full member of APALA because they said, well, you're now the only one on PEI. You have to be on our board, but this is the only position we have available. So I reluctantly agreed. I'll be president. All I had to do was chair the meetings. But in that process, I became engaged in the CSLA level and the CSLA's work. What are we? The Working Group on Climate Adaptation, I think is our formal name. And Colleen Mercer-Clark, who I mentioned at the beginning, her and I have continued to work closely together, and we drafted the CSLA's position paper on climate change. And what I love about this position paper is that it's a positive approach. Like, let's stop talking about climate change like it's this doomsday scenario. As landscape architects, we should be able to see the opportunities here. We can build resilient communities regardless of what the impacts are. That should be our goal regardless of climate change, right? It's about building resilience in it. And we come back from whether it's fires or floods, we need to be resilient in anything that we do. So resilience, transformative, and sustainable are the terms that we like to kind of base our goals and policies on rather than adaptation, which is a bit more defensive or reactive rather than proactive. And from the CSLA's working group, I've also then joined the IFLA working group. And this has been a bit of a whirlwind 2 years with IFLA because, again, partnering with Colleen, we started the IFLA's working group on climate adaptation. But as Canadians and as women, we've really been celebrated on a global scale of trying to lead this discussion and to have just a global accord where all of the national associations within IFLA are signing on. We first had the World Council. They ratified the accord in Montreal. We have the 5 regional areas, various national associations. I will say CSLA was the first, obviously because we were leading it. And now we're at the component level. I'm just missing SALA. I'm hoping within the week. I'll have them before the next board meeting. And once we've got the components, then CSLA is going to take that to the next level of discussion and say, maybe it's the schools that need to ratify the accord. Let's kind of join together and recognize that our profession has a role in recognizing climate change as an issue, and that we have roles as leaders in this discussion. We bring to the table something really unique that a lot of the other professions don't have, and that's that human element and environmental element together. And then we plan to reach into the allied professions. So it's expanding not just within CSLA, but within each of the national associations working on this initiative. And so that's pretty exciting stuff. And I think I'll leave it there. That's my last slide.